evening. Welcome back. Perhaps today on your cell phones, you heard something like this. But I guarantee you, that was not an alert that you just heard. That's actually by Mozart. I'm not kidding you. You might think that couldn't be Mozart. But that cell phone-like alert is part of the piece we're going to look at. In fact, here's another, let's do the next one. Here's another chord by Mozart from this piece. And one more. Okay, well, if you really know Mozart, you know probably it's not as loud as that and it's not held as long as that, which is true. But there are amazing dissonances in this piece, and it's a very charming, delicate andante. We're looking at the andante movement of Köchel's 614. 614, normally, it's a E-flat major string quintet written in the last year of his life. The normally is still hanging there. I'll get back to that. Written in the last year of his life, his last big chamber piece. And normally one would look at the first movement of this or the last movement of this, but I think it is going to be quite interesting, at least for me, and that's the only way I can judge this, to look at this beautiful set of variations which has some strange dissonance in it and a strange, I would like to say, sense of humor. And I'm only hesitating because I know that not everyone thinks that these dissonances are funny. I checked with the quintet and they do, so I feel good about that. But you know, dissonance in music, there are many different kinds. And we're going to be looking at them. There are very surface types. And then there are deeper and deeper types. And then there are structural dissonances, like when it changes key. So a minor dissonance, if you think of real life, a minor dissonance would be like you're in a movie theater and the person in front of you is in front of you a little bit and you go like that, or they go like this. And that's a very minor dissonance. That's like a passing tone. And at that moment of the dissonance, the person's blocking your view. So a deeper dissonance would be, let's say, a suspension, which is a very common thing in music. This note is part of this chord, and then it's held over into this chord where it doesn't belong, and then it resolves. That's very common, and that kind of dissonance is like if you get your jacket caught in a door and then you pull it, and it's fine. It's very, very, very minor. You have a lot of upper neighbor dissonances. Here's an upper neighbor dissonance. Or a lower neighbor. Or here's another lower neighbor. You might have a lot of them. Those are all lower neighbors. That reminds me of when I lived on 72nd Street and my neighbor downstairs used to bang my floor with her broom, which was her ceiling. It was just a minor dissonance. But if you go, let's say you go upstairs to borrow a cup of gluten-free flour or something like that. If you borrow the cup and come downstairs and then bring it back, that's an upper neighbor. It's very trivial. So something like this. Or in a minor key. That's if perhaps you were borrowing something more serious, I guess. But if you go upstairs and you stay there for an hour, that's a very different kind of dissonance. And if you go upstairs and you stay there for a week, that's a structural dissonance, like a change of key. You're now in a different apartment. And then you have, oh, I'm glad you're enjoying this. And then you also have functional dissonance. A functional dissonance is a chord that needs to resolve. It's dissonant, not because the chord itself is so tense, but just tense enough to have to resolve. So we know that it has a function, like a kitchen has a function. It's not just a room, it's this place where you cook. It could do this, which might mean that you don't cook there, you just order in. Okay. Okay. I think we better start the piece now. So let's start the piece with this beautiful, simple theme. And I even hesitate to say beautiful, because it's so simple that it's almost banal, which is on purpose by Mozart, I'm sure. Let's check it out. then there's a part two. Let's hear part two of the theme. Great, that's the theme. Now, for people who don't like classical music or don't know what classical music is, which is usually the same kind of person, they might hear that and think that that's classical music and it's boring. That is kind of boring. It's just a little nothing theme. But the whole idea of that theme is to do strange things with it after you hear it. The idea is to transgress that theme, to test its limits, to test its rhythmic limits, to test its harmonic limits, to test its chromatic dissonance, to see how far can you take those ideas as the composer and the performers and make it almost uncomfortable. And then you return to normalcy, or you don't and you become transcendent. So it's a matter that this represents the normalcy. This is a situation which you know, if you're a classical music fan, you know that's just a setup for either the humor or the drama that's going to follow. So it's like in any play, movie, novel, where the first scene, nothing may happen dramatically because you have to meet the characters and they're just sitting there. Not all drama is that way, but it can be. So I want to take a look at that and show you how little dissonance there is there, because there's going to be more and more until we get to those alerts at the end. So, for example, the first phrase, obviously it's one chord, and then we have the only note that is not part of a chord is this E flat. It's nothing. That's one of those passing tones, and it goes by very quickly. In fact, there's nothing but E flat passing tones until this chord. You probably heard that when it happened, right? You might have had just a glimmer of emotion. Because that chord has a note that's not in the key. So that chord is our first hint that something interesting might happen, but not a lot. If you fell asleep during that theme, that's fine. You won't fall asleep during the rest of it. Could you just play where that chord happens, like let's say bar, well, right on the pickup to that. Actually, the phrase that goes yum bum bum yum bum bum bum, and then yadum. So bar 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 with the pickup into 5. That's it, that one F sharp. Now, there's a reason I'm drawing your attention to that. Because even though that is almost a triviality, it's normal if you're in B flat major. How many of you have been in B flat major? Okay. If you're in B flat major, if you hear an F sharp moving like that, it's very common. But with Mozart, nothing even that common. Something will happen to that F sharp. And the reason I say something will happen, not only because I know it does, but because with Mozart, every little detail becomes important. And that's one of the reasons that the music endures, because one of the things that makes Mozart's music so extraordinary, and this is also true of Haydn and Schubert and Beethoven, but in different ways, is that the normal, simple setup that gives you the sense of limitations that will be transgressed. The thing that is the scene one. Every detail of that will be explored. So what are the details? We have that F sharp, and we have this very brilliant idea. Okay, I mean, it's not much, right? I happen to know, I found Mozart's sketchbook, that he actually wrote a few versions of these three notes. One of them was this. Okay, he didn't use that, he gave it up. And another one was, which he also, and then he wrote this whole thing out. Gave that up too. Okay, so okay, thanks. So now the F sharp. The two things we're going to concentrate on are yup, bop, ba. Now those two notes are pickups. It's not bum, bum, ba. It's yum, bum, ba, which is a slow gavotte. A gavotte is a dance that goes yup, bop, ba, like yup, bop, ba, da, 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 bop, ba. And the klezmer version of that is the oi gavotte. Which, okay. So it is the first lecture. So I'm warming up. Okay. So then after you hear all of that, we get into the first, it's just a transition. The first section where things start to get a little weird, and they get weirder and weirder and weirder. That's important to remember, that if someone asks you about classical music who doesn't understand anything, don't just act like, I'm not going to say what I was going to say because it's too political, but don't just think that. No. I don't. I'll say it later. But in other words, if they don't understand it, the simplest thing to say is that it's not about the normalcy. It's not about the pretty, and it is not about the soothing, which is what they always say. It's about setting up the soothing for an incredible transgression of that, which usually leads to something transcendent and profound. You have to stay with it. You can't turn off before it gets going. So here's the very first, it's a little transition back to the theme. So let's start right at the B flats in the cello, at bar, whatever that is, 14, 15, 16, yeah. We start with the theme again in a different key. Okay, so that's a transition. Now the transition starts with the feeling that it might be going into a minor key and everything's going to shift. Could you just play that first bar again? Or you can start in the same place. But let's stop on the first full chord. I'll stop you. Right. Okay. Okay, good, thanks. You can stop. Okay, that's an E flat minor chord. And that's our first minor chord in this piece of any kind. It's not really, there are little ones that go by, but the first minor chord that's not in the key. And it's kind of disturbing. And it lasts just long enough for, at the moment when you're thinking, wait a minute, is this gonna, and then no, it's not. It goes back to being major. It turns out that this G flat that makes it minor, here's the E flat major. This G flat that makes it minor goes away immediately. And when it goes away, we realize that that G flat was an F sharp. That's the F sharp I was talking about. In other words, the first dissonance in the piece, it's not really in other words, it's just more words. The first F sharp here at the beginning comes back disguised as a G flat and then goes away. And because it goes away, it was not a G flat, it was just an F sharp leading back. Let's play that measure again and you'll see how it leads back. The same spot with the B flats before. Disappears, but it comes back on the top now. And it disappears. Okay, now, this is very important because this is the beginning of the dissonance and the sense of transgression. That G flat that creates this minor mood, at first it's foreboding, then it goes away. And then when it's on the top, you know it's going to go away because it's symmetrical. And you feel the symmetry of this class. Most classical music is symmetrical. So once you hear this, when you hear it again a moment later, you know that it's going to go away. The symmetry means that it's balanced, it's twice. The symmetry in general is true of most storytelling. There's usually a third time when things change. Because if it only happens once, it's not normal yet. It has to happen twice. So balance, and blues songs are like that, you know. A line, the same line, and the third line is different. Maybe you can think of one right now. But my violist left me. I'm feeling sad. My violist left me, I'm feeling sad. And the third one, my violist left me and it ain't so bad. So the third one is the one that breaks the symmetry, and that's true in blues. Well, they still have a string quartet if one viola leads, right? Okay. So this moves on, and what that accomplished, though, is that section you just heard also changes key. It goes from the key of B flat through this mysterious passage work into the key of F, which is just a dominant. So when, you know, if I throw a word around that you don't know, you have several choices, like dominant. You can assume that you know what it means, and you might be right. You can look it up on your phone. You can look it up later. Or you could pretend you know, which is actually a very American thing to do. So, but what I mean is that the key is B flat, and we now are we have made our way to F, and now we're doing the same thing in the dominant. The dominant means 5 up from the key. And it's the strongest key beside the tonic and dominant. So now let's hear without the first violin what happens next, starting at bar 25 and pick up to 26. Okay, now wait a minute. Didn't we hear that in the other key already? We did. So did we need 5 people? I don't think so. I mean, there was a lot of redundancy. You could do that with 4 people. So he's sitting here thinking, crying is catching on in America. Okay, so next he'll be screaming. Okay, so the thing is, he feels like he's free. He's been liberated from the quartet. They're playing the same old thing, and this is what he does. Do the same thing, but with everybody. Okay, great. Now, he's doing several things. Obviously, the main thing is he's ornamenting like crazy. Ornamentation is probably the most direct and simplest thing you can do in a variation. So this is the first variation. What we've had so far was the theme with absolutely no dissonance, really, the most subtle kinds of dissonance and the kind that you can ignore. But you shouldn't. You ignore it at your peril, because the F sharp comes back as, that was really strange, but anyway, the F sharp comes back as a G flat, you go into E flat minor, it changes key, it starts again, and the first violin now lets us know that we're in the first variation. Now, not only is it ornamentation, but it is rhythmically far more active. And it's not just the 16ths, the daka, 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 that we've had that already, but it's the rests. And not only are there rests, but almost every rest is followed by a note that is dissonant or goes to a note that is dissonant. They're minor dissonances. So that's dissonant, and they all go away, and this is dissonant. But these are some little tiny dissonances. This is like, fruit flies, and not a lot of fruit flies, And then I'm just stopping on them for a second, and then, right. So, but the important thing to realize is we have had an increase in dissonance, both rhythmic and pitch-wise, And the increase is going to keep going until we get to those alerts that you heard, which are really bizarre. So, and this is not unusual, except that it's Mozart, and so he always does everything differently. I mean, you could look at every piece he wrote and you'd find something that he didn't do in another piece. It's just unbelievable. I haven't done that yet, look at every single piece to find it, but I feel like it's true. And it seems to be true, and everyone else who's written about Mozart or talks about it seems to agree that it's always different. There's always another idea, even when some things are the same. So far, everything we've heard, he's done things like that in other pieces. But we are getting to a kind of dissonance that is quite special. Okay, so then comes the passage that before you hear the passage, I just want to play something for you, and you try to figure out what do you think this is. It might make you think of Cole Porter, or it's the next passage in the Mozart, but at the wrong tempo. Those chords, those dissonances are in the next section. Let's hear it. 33? Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, now it goes by very quickly. Let's play it a little slower, just for fun. And instead of doing sforzandi, just make them lush chords. And let's see if we can bring out those harmonies in a way that's not really the way the piece goes, but that brings out how strange this is for the style. Okay, the only thing I would say is in bar 35, the chord disappeared before the first violin finished the first beat, so we lost the dissonance. Just try that beat, right, the downbeat of 35. Yeah, good. Yeah, because I just wanted to hear that. And then, okay. Now, sometimes it's interesting to, that passage is incredibly great, and it's amazing how it just goes by. Because for Mozart, every passage, and again, this is true of Beethoven and Schubert, and quite a few great composers, but it's so amazing in Mozart how the smallest transitional passage, everything is full of gems, full of richness. That's why I slowed that down. It's just unbelievable that that's just a passage that goes by to get back to the theme. In it, there are some strange things. Here. So, for example, this chord releases right when that high note comes in. Otherwise, if it stayed, we'd have a jazz chord, which, and right there, if we dwelled on that, that's another chord very popular in the early 20th century. And again, here, the downbeat is this. This is a ninth chord. If I held this chord, we would get this. You see, these harmonies and these melodies are things that you hear in Harold Arlen and Gershwin and Cole Porter, and you also hear them in different ways in classical music of the 19th century, but not quite. The phrasing is everything. It's just right like that. Now, of course, those were slowed down, but the dissonance here actually occurs in another Mozart piece, which I'll play for you in a moment. If you remember the opening of this so-called dissonant quartet of Mozart, it goes like this. So what happens is this. It's incredible. But what's really amazing about it is not only that it's dissonant in a way that seems to stretch, it's painful, it's weird, it's bizarre, but it also can be, it's coherent. It makes perfect sense within the harmonic language of the time. It's logical. That's what's great about it. In other words, it's both bizarre and coherent. Just being strange, that's not so hard. Maintaining maintaining the balance of the strangeness and the logic that comes with the chords is what's so amazing. So for example, what happens here is we had in the back in the quintet, a cadence in F major, and this, all by himself, the first violin decides to change the key with an A flat. And the fact that the A was down here, and then the A flat is up here, that distance, which is similar to this one of the other piece, instead of an A flat and an A, it's in one it's an A and an A flat. But still, they're so far apart that dissonance is exacerbated. It's made much more intense because of the distance is also weird. If they were next to each other, it wouldn't be as weird. If it went, because we would hear the, and then, but this is very strange. So I think I made my case. And thank you for giving me time to complete that investigation. Okay, now, moving on from there, the theme comes back, and now the second violinist suddenly was looking at the first violinist, or listening, thinking, wait a minute, they can play this tune without me too. So now they play it, and the second violin gets a chance to ornament the music. But, yeah. Okay, now the next thing that happens is the cello and the viola, the first viola takes some chances with it, which we can skip that for now. Then, no, let's do it. Okay, let's do the next phrase, and then we'll get on to where things get stranger and stranger. Wait a minute, wait a second. Did you want to start at 44? Yeah, 44. So we need the viola there. Okay, now not only did we have the second violin coming back and the viola and the cello ornamenting, but we went back to the original key. So it was a little longer than you might have expected to go back to the key. Nothing crazy is happening there. Now, if you know Mozart's music, you know that he really felt like these normalcies, these simple forms, were like straitjackets. And he was always bursting out of straitjackets. You know, when people talk about his scatological letters, which he wrote some to his sister, but many more to his female cousin, first cousin, or, you know, the crazy sense of humor, which is scattered throughout many letters, but also he wrote riddles and wrote jokes. And that people even wondered if maybe he were either bipolar, which there's no evidence for, or had Tourette's syndrome, which there's no evidence for. But, you know, it's really fun to try to diagnose people far away and long ago. But what really the point is that if you think of him in a society that is incredibly uptight, he was just trying to be normal, whatever that means. But I mean, in other words, if any of us living the life we live now were suddenly in the 18th century in Vienna, I think we would jump off tables and write scatological letters and go crazy and probably put many more dissonances in our pieces than we would have before. So I introduced that topic now because Mozart always started throwing things into his pieces just to shake up the form. So that's the next section, is what happens is he starts to do things that almost sounds like he's making fun of the piece, and he starts laughing too. Let's hear the next section. Now, what was all that? That's the point. You could relate it to other things, because actually that's how the human mind works. You could relate, if somebody threw something incredibly unrelated to this, like a ragtime measure in here, I could probably explain to you how that got there, even if it's just because we needed a relief at that moment, and et cetera, et cetera. In other words, yes, we can find connections between the harmonies, gestures are there. But the main thing is that this is new. It has a mocking tone. Why don't you do it one more time? And can you exaggerate emotionally the sense of mocking? And not only that, let's make the da-da-da, that whole thing as funny as you can, as if you were in an opera. Okay, that is very playful, crazy stuff. And it doesn't really belong there, except without that, it wouldn't be Mozart. All right, moving right along. The next section this is still a set of variations, but what you just heard there wasn't really a variation only. It was a variation plus something. That's allowed. It costs more. Okay, so then, actually may not be allowed. Somebody, I just read something about, are rules meant to be broken, aren't they? It's a complicated question. First you have to learn how to use them and then you break them. But actually, in classical music, the rules are made to start, you have to use them in order to break them. You have to do both. Because if you don't use the rules, you can't set up the environment for breaking them. And one of the great things about classical music is that it doesn't assume, and by classical at the moment, I am talking about the 18th century. I'm not using it the way marketers use it. I'm using it specifically to mean Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, that sort of thing. That there's never an assumption that you already know enough, well, with Beethoven sometimes, but that you know enough that they can just plunge into the most dramatic part of the piece. You have to save that. You have to earn it. You start with the rules. Sometimes you break a rule at the beginning, but basically there are some rules that are established in a sense of normalcy. This is an extreme example where he starts with something incredibly simple and basic and almost boring and gets crazier and crazier and crazier. Now, the next section starts like this. So you know it's going to be this, right? Something like it might be this. But actually what he does, just play that, a couple of bars of that. Okay, now that's a shock. It is a shock, even if you're prepared for it. Of course, I set you up to be even worse. But it is a surprise, because we've been hearing and so we expect a minor one, but instead we get, if you want to know the name of the chord, you don't have to know it, and no one's going to test you on it unless you happen to be in Vienna for a week. And they're always testing people about these things there. But it's a dominant minor ninth. So it's a dominant 7 with a 9. Now, if you wonder what about all these numbers are, it's really simple. Chords are built in thirds. 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. That's all. So it's a ninth. That's a 1, 3, 5 is a triad. 1, 3, 5, 7 is a seventh chord. 1, 3, 5, 7, 9 is a ninth chord. You don't need a lot of math to do this kind of musical stuff, just so you know. In fact, it's not math. It's arithmetic. Okay, so anyway, but interesting things happen. So we got a huge fake out right there. Then it comes back with so in other words, this passage again has one fake out after another. Then there's another one that's about to happen where we get this. So you're expecting something bizarre, like, you know, but actually this time it's just what it should have been. That's also a joke. Is it funny or is it serious? When this happens, okay, let's talk about this for a second, because this is really important. Is it funny or is it serious? Both is good. Both is usually one of those answers that always works, especially when a leading question is asked. But don't forget that Mel Brooks said that tragedy is when I cut my finger, and comedy is when you fall down a sewer and die. It's a great way of thinking about it. So basically that chord reminds me of, in Beethoven's Opus 135, that's the one that's Muss es sein, is the question. There's a very, very dramatic opening. And the more you know about it, the more you read the story behind it, it starts to sound funny. And then you realize it's a dramatic, almost operatic melodrama. It's not meant to be serious. It's meant to be mocking. This, in a way, is funny, and the only thing that's dramatic about it is the chord itself we associate with drama and with resolutions in minor keys, which are serious. But the fact that it's a fake out is somewhat humorous. Now, there's more and more of is it funny or not coming up in this piece. So let's hear, and then the mocking comes back. Let's hear this section, which is extraordinary because it has a big fake out, a kind of interesting, sweet follow-up to that. Then you think you're going to get another fake out, and he does what he should have done the first time. Then the mocking comes back, and the laughter comes back. So let's hear that little section. Okay, so that's that section. You're getting a nice balance of the familiar and the unexpected here. Now, the next section is where things get, it's the strangest part of the piece. This is where I think it's funny, and so do they. So I hope you do too. Can we just hear the violas and the cello first, starting at that pick up to 79? Okay, now that's just what you would expect. The second violin is sort of mediating between the first violin and the viola. Let's hear it with the second violin, and the first violin, I mean. Sorry, no first violin, second violin. Okay, now that note, the first note, is a little odd, because even though the rhythm that he's playing goes with them, the note goes with him. Now let's just hear the two violins. They don't play the pickup. Now, how does that fit in? Let's hear just that much with everybody. Okay, now wait a minute. Don't you know when to come in and what key to play in? This is really, he's off. He starts late. They go yum, bum, bum, and on the downbeat he goes yum, bum, bum. He's late. He's very late, and he's in the wrong key, and so are you. Now, so does Mozart love stuff like this? You know, it's part of his sense of humor, and you might know his musical joke, which actually I think this is funnier. The musical joke, humor in Mozart's family was huge, even though they also fought a lot and were very dark. But basically, they were funny. And for example, the Toy Symphony is not by Haydn, it's by Leopold Mozart. That's been known for a long time now. Leopold, Mozart's father, wrote some silly, funny pieces. He wrote a piece with barking dogs in it. He was a character. So even though the image of Leopold is, in some ways, is very stern, controlling father, which is true, he also was funny, and as a composer did things that make you think of Peter Schickele or even Peter Cuba. So basically, in his musical joke, there are 3 huge jokes and hundreds of tiny, crazy jokes. The tiny, crazy jokes are for people who really listen carefully to phrase structure. All the phrases are ridiculous. None of them make sense. The harmonies go on too long before they change. It's all out of balance, but that's sophisticated. So in case you don't get that, he writes some really stupid jokes as well, like the horns coming in on all the wrong notes. It's very obvious. The last 2 chords of the musical joke are in 3 keys, so that you hear, instead of, you also hear, and so it's kind of like, that's how it ends, all at once. But a very simple one to hear is there's a violin cadenza in the second movement, which goes like this at the end of the cadenza. It slows down, you know, because the idea is that the violinist is scared to play up that high. It slows down and all the notes are wrong. And of course, it so happens that's a whole tone scale. Until the last note. That whole tone scale, I believe, is the first whole tone scale in any Western music. It's there as a joke. It's meant to be ridiculous. The last 2 chords of the piece are the first time in any piece of music that I know of or where you're in 3 keys at the same time. It's meant to be funny. But these are interesting devices that come back in the 20th century with a whole different, without necessarily being funny. And sometimes they are funny. So we know that Mozart thinks of humor in a very specific way. So what happens in this piece right now with the first violin coming in late in the wrong key with the second violin, who is really doing what a good chamber musician should do, is he's accompanying him in the wrong key late, but then fitting with their rhythm. And the first violin basically says, whoops, and instead of cadencing with them, just falls down a scale. Let's hear just that again, and see if you can make that sound like you're falling down a scale because you can't help it. Good, good, good. And that's great. So then it happens again in a different key. And again, the first violinist is in the wrong key. But this time the chord is even a little worse. But let's just play it the way it's written first. Yeah, it's basically the same idea, but it's in a different key and it's revoiced. But we don't need to go into all the details. But of course, he's revoiced it so that it's fresh and the key change. You're also thinking, that's not going to happen again, is it? Yes, of course it is, because who said that? Somebody said, of course it is. Good. Okay, good. Because it's symmetry. It's Mozart. He has to do it twice, doesn't he? Does he have to do it 3 times? He does do it 3 times. But the 3rd time, something has to be different, because that's the way things go in comedy and drama and the blues. So you get the first version, then it's a change of key and revoiced, but it's the same joke. And then the third time, the first violin, instead of just falling down the scale, changes his mind and changes everybody's mind with him. Let's try the third one. Thinking about it? Maybe one more change of key would be good. Ah, there it is. Okay. Those silences are just rests. I just talk in them. That's, in other words, it doesn't say, let's try another key. That's it. Okay, good for you. So this passage is why I wanted to talk about this movement, because it's, even though Mozart does crazy things in many of his pieces, this is a unique example of a kind of dissonance that is funny and strange and very personal, and just in a little movement between all these big movements. It's just a short theme and variations. So I'm going to ask them to play that again, but before they do, so the first violin just went up the scale and then suggests staying in the key that we're in, perhaps. And then there's a silence while they think it over. The silence is hilarious. And then maybe that's the key we should go in. And now those are actually going to the same key. Back to here. So it's not like he's really changing his mind about the key. But the path there, it's kind of before GPS. He's recalculating. That's what it is. That's exactly what it is. He's in a key, there's a silence, he goes, let's go here. And then it's recalculating, but actually, we were right. We're right, it's B flat major. Recalculating should be put right in there in those silences. So I want you to think recalculating in the silences. So let's play this entire section. You can play along. Starting at the pick up to 79 all the way through until where we just stopped. And we're back. Okay, so when they get back home, which is literally what B flat is if you're in the key of B flat, they're all really happy. So they start ornamenting their brains out. And so, I think that these ornaments now should be hyper sounding. You're ecstatic. And you're sharing, they all take advantage of the ornaments. It starts off second violin and first viola. It spreads at a few places to down the path, and it ends up that everybody gets a chance. The first violin is kind of holding down the fort for a while, trying to be responsible. But then the laughter comes back, and they all laugh a few times together. Remember, we had two kinds of laughter. One is da 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 da, which is that kind of jittery laughter. And then you have yap ba 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 bum be da, that kind of staggered laugh. Now, the thing is, why does that sound like laughter? And why do we have to know why? Because it's a lecture. No, but I mean, come on. First of all, people analyze everything these days. So I'm going to analyze this, as they say. But it sounds like laughter because the rhythm of it and even the dynamics. The first one, bah, bah, is a huge laugh, and then it staggers away and then has a slight resurgence. It is actually viscerally like laughter. Can you play bar 107 into the downbeat of 108? Yeah, I mean, without leaving the bounds of music, the boundaries that make it music, it's laughter. Mozart wrote in one of his famous letters that in opera, if a character is extremely angry or violent, the music can go very, very far in that emotion, but it should never stop being music. Now, he never explained, but we know what he means. In other words, he would not destroy the fabric completely so that which people would do now and have for a long time, that you could do something that literally sounds violent. But with him, the violence has to be disruptive of a normalcy that is set up in the music. So just like that, the laughter here is not going to be an exact imitation. It's not going to be someone flips on a recording of someone laughing in New York and that's part of the piece. That's fine, now that you can do something like that. But it's wonderful how close he gets to reality, the physical reality of laughter, without actually having to make it sound like you have to think, oh, that's laughter in order to enjoy it. You don't have to think of these things. But it does work. Now, in fact, speaking of laughter, let's do that entire laughing passage, because it's a little longer than that, and start the final gestures. So let's go from 106, starting on the second beat. Yeah, all the way to the end. That's not very far. With everybody, why not? Now, just to make a point about how much Mozart loves dissonance, that little thing you just heard could have been this. That would be a scale. That's not what you heard. Now, in court, you might think that's what you heard. Did you hear this? I think so, yeah. No, you did not hear this. Now, I don't believe anything. It's this. It's got two dissonances. Instead of starting here, which would have doubled the note in the second violin. That's one reason to avoid it. But the other is that it's crunchier and funnier and more in keeping with what he did to have little dissonances. Okay, now, I just want to say something about dissonance that is not music before we hear this. The word dissonance is used a lot. It's used mostly for music. We all know the phrase cognitive dissonance, when you've got competing ideas, like you shouldn't smoke, but you do. That's a kind of dissonance. But I was thinking more of dissonance in poetry, because Mozart's rhythms have a relationship to that. For example, that laughter is rhythmically dissonant to everything else. It disrupts the pattern. So if you, in Shakespeare, for example, there are lots of great examples of dissonance within the meter. Here's one of my favorites from Macbeth. Of all men else I have avoided thee, but get thee back. My soul is too much charged with blood of thine already. How is that dissonance? Not because it's about blood and stuff. Because the first line goes, of all men else I have avoided thee. You don't say it that way, but it's there. And the second would be, but get thee back. My soul is too much charged with blood of thine already. Boom. But get thee back. Period. New thought. My soul is too much charged into the next line with blood. So in fact, the rhythm is there. The pulse and the meter are there, but the rhythm is off. Now the difference is, we often use the word rhythm loosely. I wish you would stop doing that. But the word rhythm is, for a musician, the rhythm is the articulation on top. The pulse is on the bottom. Bum, ba, bum, ba, bum. That's the pulse. The meter would be the time signature, like 3/4, or in this case, iambic pentameter, it's 5. Ba-ding, ga-dung, 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 ga-dung. This is the pulse. 5 is the meter. Da-dum, ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. And the rhythm is crazy. But get thee back. My soul is too much charged with blood of thine already. You can't find the meter. Or the pulse is not really there either. But because it is there underneath, we feel dissonance. You like that? Okay, I didn't make this up. Okay, and one other thing I want to say before they play this straight through, or maybe two other things. The way Mozart brings the entire melody of the theme back with 4 of them playing it and 1 ornamenting makes it sound like one of them is commenting on the others. You know, like they're performing the piece and the other one is commenting. And that's not typical of a theme in variations because usually they're all involved in the variation or the person is ornamenting it and also playing the melody. Here there's this weird detachment of the observer, ornamenter, and the group. And to me that makes me think of Midsummer Night's Dream at the end where the mechanicals, the actors, are putting on a play. And while they're putting on the play and acting really, really badly and with a terrible script, the aristocrats who are sitting around them are talking about them and ornamenting and making fun, basically, of the performance. So, for example, on stage, Pyramus says, and he's one of the bad actors, and he says, but what see I? No Thisbe do I see, O wicked wall through whom I see no bliss. Cursed be thy stones for thus deceiving me. And usually it's done just like that because it's terrible. Meanwhile, Theseus says, the wall methinks being sensible should curse again. And Hippolytus says, this is the silliest stuff I ever heard while this is going on, which is the same as saying, that's the most ridiculous thing I ever heard. So, and then it keeps going. They say all the wrong words, like at the end, thus die I, thus, thus, thus. Right, remember this? Moving along later, moon take thy flight, now die, 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 which is not the greatest writing. And Demetrius, who's watching this, says no die, but an ace for him, for he is but one, meaning, you know, the die, one die, not two dice. It's a kind of verbal ornamentation while the bad show is going on. That's kind of what happens here. The little simple melody gets played over and over and over, and nothing changes except the people around it. And then eventually they start laughing, and then when they start laughing, they start playing it wrong, and it's a big mess, and then they have a great time. And that's basically what's going on here. Okay, so now let's hear the entire movement, and if you laugh out loud, that's, you know, fine. Well, see you next week for Beethoven's Kreutzer Sonata, and let's just hope that alerts like that are just passing tones. See you next time. Bye-bye.